Hi everyone, welcome to Start Your Art. I'm Misty and I'm your host. Today I have a very special guest, Jill Poyerd. She is a contemporary landscape artist and she is an amazing art educator. Today we're going to be talking about the benefits of learning the foundations. Be sure to grab your journals and the art supplies listed in our lesson and get ready to start. We have a great interview that we will be able to experience with Jill. Welcome, Jill. I'm so glad that you joined us. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and just share a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah, well, I've been a professional artist for, goodness, I don't know how many years now, 12 or 15 maybe. I've been playing with art my whole life. My mother was an oil painter, actually. And so just from an early age, I was working with oils, actually. And in college, I took some art classes, although I really wasn't an art major. It wasn't until I had my son, and he was about 5 years old, when I needed to find something for myself, some interest of my own. And my mother said, "Why don't you take a watercolor class?" So I was like, well, all right, so that's what I did. And one thing led to another. I had a really good teacher. She was really talented. And pretty soon I felt like I had absorbed everything I could from her. I went and just worked on my own and really, really pushed through the learning curve on my own to develop what I think is a pretty unique style. I think a lot of artists really want to develop their own voice in their work. And so I really feel like that time period I had after learning the basics and before I became professional of just it's brutal, just pushing through and solving your own problems is what helped me develop what I think is my own style. So yeah, so now I've helped form and headed up a group of professional artists here in Virginia. And once I got into the video angle side of things, I developed my own YouTube channel, which has about 2.5 million views. And then I started teaching classes online. So I still paint, but it's kind of spread out now. But it's been a really great journey. And, it's been interesting because I find as you're working in art and in the creative field, you kind of slowly figure out where your interests are, where your strengths are. And there's this path that you follow, and everybody has their own path. So I'm very satisfied with where I am in my path right now. So.
I was lucky enough to find you from your classes for Udemy, and that was one of the main reasons I just knew that you had to be a part of the event, is because the one thing that you really taught me was like this importance of the foundations. And yes, building your skills to build your so-called masterpiece, but really working on the foundations and learning the skills that can actually help you create what you want to create. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about, the foundations and their importance.
Yeah, I really feel strongly about it. And what happened was when I first started to think, I think I'll develop a class because I work in watercolor as well as oil, but watercolor has a reputation of being so difficult, which it can be, but I had gotten to a point in my career where I felt like I kind of got it, I mean, it'll challenge you for the rest of your life, but I at least got to the point where I'm like, I get it. And why is it that when we teach watercolor or really any medium, this learning curve is pretty big, it's challenging. It dawned on me that we really need to go down to the heart of what we're working with. Okay, we work with paint, we work with whatever our thinner is, our solvent, we have brushes and we have a surface, but what do we really know about that? And it's kind of important, So I was doing research, and in my research, I came across information on the masters. I like to incorporate the works of the masters and what they did in everything I do, because I think, well, who better to learn from than the people we admire so much, right? So as I was researching, I noticed in the 15 and 1600s, to learn to be an artist, you had to be normally be an apprentice under a professional artist. And that could be 1 to 3 years of basically grinding pigments and mixing up the paints and preparing the surfaces. They might, if they're lucky, start learning how to draw. And that's a long time to be learning that stuff. But what it did, and this is what kind of dawned on me as well, is boy, did they know those paints inside and out. And so as I was developing some of my classes, I got to work with pigment and mix it with the binder, which binder, I mean, all paints use the same pigments, really. It's the binder that makes each one unique. So oil uses drying oil, and watercolor uses gum arabic, and acrylic uses acrylic polymer. So there's something really special about it when you can get that kinetic experience of actually pouring out some pigment, pouring out your binder, mixing it together, and lo and behold, you have paint, you know? So I thought, we need to teach this. I need to teach this. I need to get people to really know their materials. Things like, what are the different grinds of a pigment, and what's the difference between transparency and opacity? How does that impact your work and your laying on of paint, regardless of medium? Also, the binders, depending on the binder, that can help determine the drying time and how it performs. How do you thin it? The other thing is brush bristles. I felt like, okay, well, we normally teach, here are the different shapes of brush and, the different sizes. But what we weren't teaching too much was, what is it made of? So what's the difference between a sable and a synthetic, or goat hair versus hog bristle? And how does that affect your paint and your application? And it turns out all these things have a really big impact. And if you can really get to know them, if you can learn all this, you'll improve as an artist. And I'll just stop there for a minute, because it also includes what you're painting on. Your painting surface has different absorbency levels. So if you think about it, if you're painting on a dish, a ceramic dish versus a, what is it called, a paper plate, the absorption level is totally different. Can you imagine, the impact it would have? So that also leads me to another foundation that I felt was really important, and that is brush strokes. And I developed a whole class on this, because after I did my initial class, I thought, there's a class that we're missing in art, and that is getting down to individual brush strokes, as opposed to just following, and this is important. I'm not saying it's not important to follow what other people do. We learn by mimicking, but we can also learn a different way. And so I went into this deep study of looking at the masters, looking at contemporary artists, and figuring out what brush strokes they used specifically. So a lot of people know about glazing, but there are so many other ones. And if you can learn them, you now have this tool chest at your disposal of, well, for me, it was 22 different brush strokes. If you know how the brush stroke, what kind of impact it has, what does it look like, what characteristics does that stroke have? Some are kind of broken up looking, others are very smooth and seamless. Then when you go to paint your painting and you have a vision for a certain part of your painting, you have, again, your tool chest you can work from and say, you know what, to get that look, I can use feathered strokes or broken strokes, So I just felt like there's some real in-depth information that could make life a lot easier for artists as they learn and as they produce their work.
I couldn't agree more. And as you know, as we talked previously, one of the big things that I did for my year was actually go in depth with all those brushstrokes and really learning what my brushes did and how they worked. And it's made such a difference, and it made an impact in my own work. So being able to learn about needing to know these skills to help me improve as an artist was a fundamental change for me. And I'm still continuing that process, even though I've been doing it for, I think it's almost a year now that I've been working with my brushstrokes, but I still have so much to learn. And so that, you know, that's just something that is, I think you're right, that I think it's just something that we're going to continue to learn no matter how far we advance as artists.
Yeah. I think part of what it does is it takes away some of the fear. Not only, I mean, I'm talking about both the brush strokes and also learning a lot of the foundations, because if it's almost like being a chef, if you're going to cook a grand meal, if you know your materials and, you know, spicing and knife skills and everything, it's going to be much less fearful when you go in the kitchen to prepare than if you were just, you know, not real knowledgeable. But it also, and I find with watercolor too, in particular, because it works with water, and water has such unique characteristics and itself can be somewhat unpredictable. I think that's where a lot of the mystery was coming in with watercolor, and artists would get surprised. You know, it was hard to predict what would happen. And so by studying water and the properties of water, which for watercolor, it's not only what you thin the paint with, but it's the vehicle that it travels in. It takes the mystery out of it a little bit. And I also think if you have foundational information in brush strokes, you can be more creative, because you can move beyond what someone else is doing and you can start to just branch out on your own.
I learned that even from my own journey, and I'm able to do so much more now that I know how my brushes work and how much water that they hold, and just I've learned so much. There's so much value in learning these foundations. It's really made an impact, and just my play creative time, and just seeing what magically unfolds. And it really did remove that fear for me to just play and like really take that time to find, like for me it's fun. Like I found so much fun learning just my brush strokes, and I spend at least 15 minutes a day just doing brush play because I ended up really loving it and having
I'm so glad.
fun.
That is awesome. I'm so glad. And that also reminds me too, is that people, I think, we're always as humans trying to, well, maybe not everybody, but I know I was someone who, if I would sit down just to do a practice session, I'd almost put this unrealistic pressure, like everything I do has to be a masterpiece, you know, but it doesn't. And then that's something I learned, you know, a couple of years ago, where I'm like, okay, now really, you can just have fun and just enjoy it, you know, and then you make more progress actually.
Yeah, that's something that I found, is that instead of, at least for my own practice, it's not so much weight on this next masterpiece or this next work of art, but really coming playful and joyful into my studio, to where it was actually fun to be, instead of making it a job where it's just so hard and it just feels so constrictive.
And that'll show up in your painting. I think so. I think your moods show up in your work, but especially like if you're having fun, you know, that it shows. It really does.
It really does. And it's amazing, because I can go back and look at days that I'm just like, you can really tell my head's not there. And you can just see it in my every brush stroke, and you can see when I've been rushed. You can see when I'm having fun, or you can just see when I'm just going with the flow. And it has been such a unique thing to be able to look back on these bodies of work and actually be able to see that
Yeah.
um, in that work. So I think that that is something that I hope everybody gets to be able to experience at one time or another when they're looking back at their work and be like, oh, wow,
Yeah.
I can really see, I can really see those brushstrokes and what I was going through. You know, something that you and I talked about with one another. It was like there comes a point where you use your skills to work out brushstrokes once you lose confidence in your painting. Can you share a
Hmm.
little bit more what that actually looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I even do that. I still do that. So whenever I'm going to paint a formal painting, a real painting, um, there's a ton of planning. And it was comforting actually when I was researching the masters, because I saw, hey, they did that too. You know, they would plan, maybe not every single one of them, but a lot of them did. And even the Impressionists, because when you plan to the hilt, you can go into your actual painting process with confidence. So for me, you know, I'll work out the composition, I'll do a value study. I might do, well, I'll definitely plan, sorry about that. I'll definitely plan my colors. Um, and I might do a color study if I need to, if I feel I need a little more confidence in how they'll blend. And so I'll even visualize what I'm going to do. And that's mainly my brush work. So I'll plan what brush strokes I'm going to use to produce my painting. And then, not in a weird way, but I'll like, maybe if I can't sleep, I'll just lay there and I'll think and I'll go through my process of how I'm going to paint in my head, because you're preparing your brain. So then when I go to paint, very often, honestly, you start off, you feel great, you know what you're doing, and then the creative process will take you in a different direction sometimes, you know. I mean, sometimes it gets to the point you throw away you just toss aside your reference image and just kind of go because you've kind of gotten on a track. Not always, but a lot of times. And in that situation, there's very often one spot in particular that will be my trouble spot. And when I get to it, I'll be like, shoot, I planned this, but now I don't think that's going to work. Or maybe I'll just not feel as confident, like, Ju, I'm not sure if that's going to work. And that's where I bring in my practice again. So I'll take out a piece of scrap paper and I'll practice my strokes. Or maybe I'll practice glazing, you know, a couple of glazing layers, and make sure that those colors are really going to look good together. Because, you know, when they're layered, it's different from just mixing it on your palette. And once I feel, I'll work at that until I'm confident, because why move on? I can take all the time I want, you know, and just wait until I feel confident. Then I'll proceed. And that usually does the trick. So I can usually end up with a success because of that. So yeah, I still practice. I mean, I don't have as much time to sit down and just play, but when I do, it's fun. And then on the side, you know, if I'm doing a project and I suddenly lose confidence in a spot, yeah, I'll practice, definitely.
I think it's fun that you actually will even go into doing the glazing, because that just gets you off of that one particular problem or that lack of confidence, gets you doing something else to help you kind of forget about that lack of confidence, because you know you've done it a million times.
Right.
And so you're just giving yourself something playful to do before going back to that. I had not thought about that before, because even when I have my own challenges, I will put it down and go do something else. So I had not I haven't seen it in that way until you know explained it that way.
It makes a difference. I mean, it really makes a difference. And I do it quite a bit. Again, because paintings kind of take a mind of their own, and you have to be prepared for the unexpected when you are an artist, because I don't know, it just happens.
Yeah, no, you can plan. You can make all the plans, and you can think of every possible thing, but when you are in the moment, I do believe that we have those creative insights, is what I like to call them, and it'll lead you down just an unexpected path. And I think as long as you can plan and work out those things, but be open for that unexpected creative insight as you're doing the process.
And I'll tell you, one thing I did notice too is I just finished a big project. It took me a year to prepare this one class that I just finished. And in the process, I was, again, looking at a bunch of masters and trying to get down to, it was about oil painting. And so we would go into the layers of an oil painting. And in doing this, honestly, I think, because now we have X-ray technology, so we can go down and look at their, underdrawing. I cannot believe how many masters would change their painting as they moved along, like big changes sometimes. There was a painting by, who was it? I think it was Titian, and it's in my class, but there's a painting, and I've seen it before and it's beautiful. But when I went down to look at the underdrawing, there was an angel he had painted in this one spot, and you would never know it. It was like a complete angel. So it's just been very interesting, and it humanizes them, because you realize, hey, everybody's like this. You know what I mean? Everybody, it's the creative process. We just go in different directions as we move through a painting.
Oh, that sounds so interesting, to be able to know about those stories, because I was talking to someone else where like they had all these wonderful masterpieces. It was a Canadian artist, and he had all these beautiful masterpieces. But the thing that everyone loved the most was his like sketchbooks, and just his ideas and his planning, and like all these things that he thought of before he even went to make those pieces. I'd love to be able to know what's behind some of the masterpieces that he created, even with all that planning, because I'm sure that he probably made so many more changes even during that process. That is so interesting to know, and I did not know that before you shared that with me.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
I find that the more I study them, again, the more human they get, and the more I feel like I understand the natural tendencies, how natural certain things are in the painting process. We're not unique. I mean, even Michelangelo would get frustrated, and there's a quote by him where he says, whatever, I can't remember what it is, Enzo or whatever his assistant's name is, and he says, Enzo, help me, I'm no artist, I mean, he even got to the point where he's like, I can't paint. It's so funny.
That's just amazing, and he really changed so much for us in terms of the art world and the art community. So even to know that he had those moments like that is reassuring for all of us, as we pursue our own practice. With that, what are some of your recommendations for us to practice? Like, what do you think is some of the best practice? I know that you're going to take us through an exercise and show us how we can practice this, but can you just share a little bit about that before we move into that demonstration that you have prepared for us?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is obviously learn as much as you can about your materials and push yourself. I mean, that would be one of my big things personally is try to go beyond the standard of what you know. And you can only do that by working and working and working and working. There was a book I read a long time ago, because I was actually a PR major in college. But so there was a book I read where it was talking about coming up with creative ideas and new ideas. How do people come up with fresh, outside the box ideas? And what it recommended, and I think it's true, and I mean, I've experienced it, is, you have a big whiteboard and you're brainstorming and you're pushing, and then you get to that dead wall where you're like, oh, I think that's about it. but you keep pushing, and you put anything down, just keep going, 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 going. And pretty soon, you know, you're coming up with stuff that is a little outside the box, and it's creative, and you feel refreshed, like, wow, you know. I mean, that would be one tip, is practice, but push yourself in it. You know, what else can you do? Let's say you're practicing, well, I'm going to show you some. Let's say you're practicing feathering, and you're feathering this way and that way, and pretty much you've exhausted all the methods you know of. Well, keep going, you know, maybe think of a new shape or try a different brush, you know, just change up whatever you can, change your dilution method, change the brush material. It's amazing how it can make it exciting and fun, and you can really feel like you grow when you do that.
I really couldn't agree more. And one of the things that I really can connect with is that when I first started this journey, I was always inspired by the artist that I was aspiring to be. And then when I started doing these brushstrokes and all these practices, I started not to only just be inspired by the artists that I love, but I started to get inspired by my own improvement in my work. And so that improvement that I seen actually encouraged me more to go beyond those boundaries, to try new things and just see where it goes, and be happy and celebrate all of the trying pieces and learning pieces just as much as any masterpiece that I have yet made.
That is fantastic. Exactly. You know, and you're going to improve more and faster. I mean, that's not the objective. The objective is to enjoy it and grow, but you want to enjoy it. So I'm so glad to know that.
Yeah, that's like, that was the biggest takeaway, I think, is like, and somewhere in between is that I looked back and I reflected back on all the practice, and I was just like, wow, what an improvement, what a difference, just that short period of time, really trying to learn the fundamentals, that I've been able, you know, to grow this much. And it was just so incredible to me. And not that I'm still learning, I'm still in that learning phase, but it was just such a big difference from where I started to where I am, that it was just so inspiring for me. Oh, and like, oh my gosh, everybody could do this. It just takes 1,000,000 years.
Yes. That's awesome though. But it's worth it, and it's fun along the way, I think.
It really is. And how blessed are we that we get to be there for those hundreds of hours painting and experimenting with, you know, with art. It's just such a blessing, I feel.
Yeah. There's something so, I don't know, painting, even drawing, any kind of really creative thing like that, where you really get into it. There's nothing like it. Your brain, I don't know. It's very therapeutic, you know? I mean, without, you know, it's just so enjoyable. It's such a moment.
It really is. Well, Jill, I think that this is a wonderful. Can you show us like some of the exercises in your, like, that we can bring to our sketchbook?
Sure. No, so what I've done is I've actually prepared a video. I actually prefer to teach that way. And I'm not in the video because I actually think it's better if I'm not there. I like my students to really focus on what I'm showing them. No distractions, you know. So what I've done is we have about 8 minutes where there's a crash course in some fundamentals, some foundational information that I think will help students understand their materials a little bit better. Again, it's very fast, but I think it'll be helpful. And then I'm going to teach 5 of the brush strokes that I teach. There's 22, but I picked 5 that I felt were very foundational, very important. So many artists use these, and you know, if you go on to study masters or just continue in your art quest, you'll recognize these. And at the very end, I show you how you can just create a very simple color study using those 5 strokes. I think it'll be really fun, and I think it'll be very beneficial for the students.
I think that will be a lot of fun. I also know that you not only have created this wonderful video, but you have also given us a wonderful free gift. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So what it is it's an ebook. Many years ago, I created it's a watercolor portrait book, how to paint watercolor portraits. But the reason I created it is because I felt like I had developed a process that made it approachable for anybody. It's not where, I mean, you know, obviously if you're going to go through formal and traditional training to do portraiture, you're going to be studying the human figure and all kinds of anatomy, you know, perspective and everything. But I've actually developed what I feel is a really good process that anybody can follow. And so I thought students might enjoy that. It is geared towards watercolor, but I think almost any medium could probably benefit. You just have to adapt it towards your particular paint. And so, I actually don't paint figures right now. I got a little burnt out, but you know, the book is good. I think it's helped people, and I think they'll enjoy it. And it's free.
Yeah, and I'm so excited myself because for the last year, I have been working on botanicals and patterns and different things like that. And as I go into my next color study, I wanted to make characters and develop those. And so I had an experience of making a portrait out of watercolor I've never done before. And wow, what an experience.
Yes, it can be challenging. One tiny little alteration can change the look of the person. I think that's why I got a little burnt out, because it can be tiring. but it's rewarding though then when you finish and you're like, wow, you know. But I will say my process, even for doing landscapes, is still very similar. The only other caveat I would make is there is a color, and I feel like I need to tell people, I love Antwerp blue. And back then I did use that color, but many years ago, kind of between the two, I discovered it is not light fast. And I'm really particular about making sure all my stuff is light fast and non-toxic. So I had to drop it. I was very, very sad. It is actually, Antwerp blue is basically like a diluted version of Prussian blue, but Prussian blue even has a few little issues. So I had to let them go. But other than that, everything, you know, is good.
And actually, Prussian blue is one of my favorite blues. There's something just magnificent about it.
I'm always toying with bringing it back in because there is no blue like that. The closest I found was Windsor blue red shade, but that one is so intense and so fine. It just doesn't perform quite like Prussian. But Prussian can sometimes, if it's in certain lighting conditions, it can change a little bit. But then when you bring it back into a lighting situation, it'll go back to normal. So, and you shouldn't, I believe that's the one that you shouldn't heat, which most people don't heat it, but just to know.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful, beautiful color. I love it.
It really is a beautiful color. Like the one thing through the color studies that I've been doing is that because I don't have a favorite color. I love all colors, and my favorite color is the color I'm using at the moment. But every time I pick that up, I get a little bit more giddier.
See, that's how I felt about Antwerp. I was heartbroken when I had to give it up. It really was one of my favorites.
You know, I guess that's some of the things that I've been learning, because I have another, it's a gemstone color, but it's no longer being made. And oh my goodness, I love that color. I have one hardened tube that I like. they weren't even selling it. It was like in the trash because it's all
Oh
hard.
no.
No, no, with watercolor, I can just cut it out of the metal.
Oh, that's true. That's true. That's so funny.
Yeah, and I was just like, I will cut the tube and I will, like, that is it. And I have it. And I'm only using pieces at a time. But I know, you know,
Was that a historic pigment, did you say?
I don't know if it's historic. It was called, I want to say it's smalt.
Oh,
Um,
smalt. Really?
oh,
Okay, that is a historic pigment.
oh,
Dare I tell you
yes, now you
about
have,
smalt?
yeah, no, you have to. Now we've brought it up. It is amazing.
It was really popular with the masters, but it did have issues.
It does. It has a,
Yeah,
but I love it.
I know. Yeah, so a lot of them used it, and sometimes that smalt would fade. But of course, that's over 100 years, or something. But you can probably still get it from. There's a website, I believe it's Natural Pigments, and
Yeah.
they have some.
I might have to do that. And because I only use it in my personal stuff. I don't use it anywhere else other than like my practice and my play because I know eventually, that pigment will be gone
Yeah.
and I get to enjoy that. I love the color. I don't even like the way it moves on my paper or the end result. I just love that color so much. And I haven't been able to find anything that's remotely close that I try to create with
See,
it.
I know. And it's funny how individual we are and how we can fall in love with certain colors. But it happens. And that's one reason a lot of people ask me, a lot of students will be like, hey, what colors should I get? And I respect that. You need some guidance when you first start. But I always make sure to say, look, as you work, branch out and research some of the other colors because you're going to find that there's some that just really appeal to you and you're going to want to trade out some colors, you know?
That is so
So,
true. Well, Jill, thank you so much. And I have learned so much from you. And I'm just so thankful that you have come on here and shared some of your wisdom and some of your knowledge. And I can't thank you enough. Thank you.
well, thank you for having me. It was really, truly my pleasure. I enjoyed it. And I think you guys will like the little video. So thanks again.
Well, everyone, I hope that you enjoyed today's session, and I look forward to seeing everyone when we do her exercises live on Facebook. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Brushstrokes are the building blocks of painting. And in this short video, I'm going to teach you 5 of them that are very foundational. But before I do that, we need to take a crash course in some very important topics, some painting fundamentals. To begin with, we need to know what paint is. All artist paints are made up of 2 primary ingredients, pigment and a liquid binder. Pigment is simply ground minerals or plant or animal matter that give the paint its color. This material is ground into a fine powder and then mixed with a special liquid called a binder. Binders give paint its workability, its form. It's really what makes paint paint and not just a pile of dust. Paint pigment particles are suspended in the liquid binder until the binder dries or hardens, leaving a layer of pigment and binder on the surface. If you didn't have a binder added to the paint, when the liquid was gone, there would be nothing to hold the pigment onto the painting surface. It could simply brush off. Binders seal the pigment onto the surface. The binder is the big difference between paints. All painting mediums use pigment to establish the color of the paint, but each one uses a different binder, giving each paint some unique characteristics. For example, watercolor uses gum arabic, oil paint uses drying oil, acrylic uses an acrylic polymer, and egg tempera uses egg yolk. Now that we understand a little bit more about what paint is, let's discuss how brushes work and how that relates to your specific paint. Brushes tend to be made for one of the 3 primary painting mediums, and each medium has certain demands that have to be met due to the nature of the paint. So for example, oil paints are thick if they aren't thinned. Therefore, the brush bristles for that paint need to be strong enough to scoop up the paint on the surface and apply it to the painting. The paint stays on top of the bristle grouping. When acrylic is used in its heavy body form, it performs in much the same way. As opposed to a fluid paint like watercolor or fluid acrylic. These paints are so thin that the paint cannot sit on top of the bristles. It needs the bristles to soak up the paint and hold it while it's carried over to the surface where it's deposited. Now, soft bristles can push around thick paint, but it doesn't pick up the paint as well. It's better used to smooth and blend the paint on the surface. Likewise, a stiff bristle brush can absorb thin paint, but it won't absorb as much paint and the application will be a bit harsh. Compare the 2 applications of the watercolor paint. The first is with the watercolor sable brush, and then with the stiffer oil brush. You can see how the soft brush is much more ideal for fluid paint. Now let's talk about thinning your paint. All paints will need to be thinned at times, and to certain degrees. This is referred to as diluting your paint, and it's an important part of painting. Let me show you what I mean. Here we have some completely undiluted watercolor paint. I'm placing a few drops of water next to the paint, and I'll mix it in. Water is the solvent for watercolor, and you can see I'm only mixing in a little of the pure paint. I'll paint a small swatch on some scrap paper to show you the effect of dilution. This would be what we would call a lightly diluted paint. Then we'll add 2 more drops of water, mix it, and then paint another swatch. The same thing can be done with oil and acrylic. You just slowly add the appropriate solvent, testing the mix as you continue to dilute. In our example, as I continue to add 2 additional drops, you can see that the color is slowly lightening. Now I'll increase our water amount. I'll put a whole bunch of drops down, and as we increase the water, the pigment particles get spread out farther, and the paint becomes less dense. The result, again, is a lighter color and more transparency, which means it's very see-through. Now, if we add the already thinned paint to a puddle of plain water, look how thin that is. That would be considered a very diluted paint. The more water, the thinner the paint, the more transparent, and the lighter the color. This thinning process again is referred to as diluting your paint. Now you always mix it up well because you want the pigment to disperse evenly in your mix. What you see here would be considered a pretty heavy dilution as compared to the pure, completely undiluted paint. Do you see that difference in the value? So in summary, when diluting your paint, you can have completely undiluted paint, lightly diluted paint, moderately diluted paint, or heavily diluted paint. What would this concept look like in oil or heavy body acrylic? Well, the thinner your paint is, the more the paint will soak into the bristles as opposed to sitting on top of them if the paint is thick. We've discussed the bristles and the different dilution levels. Now let's talk about brush load. That is, how much paint your brush can hold and how that impacts the stroke. I'm going to demonstrate this in watercolor, but it really applies to any fluid medium or even dense paint that's been diluted to a high degree. You're basically loading liquid onto the bristles. We'll begin by dipping this dry sable brush into a cup of water. I'll push it around so all the bristles get soaked, and you can see that there are little bubbles of air being released from the bristles. Once all of the bubbles are released and the bristles feel and look nice and wet, I'm going to lift my brush straight out of the water. At this point, the bristles are holding as much liquid as possible. This is what's referred to as a fully loaded brush. But let's see what this looks like with paint instead of water. We'll begin by thinning down some red paint. Again, we're using watercolor because it offers a great visual. I'm going to make this fairly diluted in order to encourage more spread. To fully load the brush, we'll let the brush rest in the liquid so it can absorb as much as possible. This can also be done on your palette or even in a cup. Once it's loaded, I lift the brush, and at this point it's holding as much of the paint mix as it can. Once again, we have a fully loaded brush. Now we'll lay it on the paper towel to see how far the paint spreads. If we had less water and more pigment, the mix would spread less. When it comes to fluid paint media, pigment adds drag, as does the binder. Now we'll reload, but this time we'll bring it down to a medium brush load. To do this, we just take a fully loaded brush and stroke it against the side of the dish or palette. Notice that the pressure automatically releases some of the paint that's held in the bristles. And then we'll lay it down on the paper towel. You can see already that there's much less spread. There was less paint mix in the bristles. Now we'll reload again. Drop some of the liquid off on the edge of the dish, and then tap the brush on paper towel to bring it down to a light brush load. And then we'll just take the brush with the remaining liquid, and that will be our dry brush load. So you can see the difference in how much paint each brush load holds. What would this look like using a denser paint such as oil or heavy body acrylic? With denser paint, it's a matter of how much paint sits on top of the bristles. The more you pick up, the heavier the load. You can see the first mark was a lightly loaded brush, the second would be a moderately loaded brush, the third a heavily loaded brush, and if we wipe off our brush and then stroke the surface, that would be a very, very dry brush. So with all of this in mind, let's move on to the actual brushstroke demonstrations. Here we are in my studio, where I'll demonstrate 5 different brush strokes, as well as a final activity that I think you might enjoy. The first thing I did was prepare my work area so that everything is within reach. No matter what media you're working in, you have to be able to reach your tools. So I have my paper, paper towel, water, this time it's watercolor, paints, palette. I'm using this one because there are only a few colors. The next thing to do is prepare the paints. In this case, I've mixed up a single color, rose violet, and I've mixed up 3 different dilutions, a light dilution, a moderate dilution, and a very heavily diluted paint. This is what it would look like in oil: undiluted, moderately diluted, and heavily diluted. Because when we're practicing, it's important to try different dilutions, different brushes, different brush loads, etc., in order to get a feel for the capabilities. One color is helpful, so you don't have to think about color mixing and how colors work together. And make it a color you like. That makes it more enjoyable. I did that for both the watercolor and the oil paint examples. Try to have a variety of brush shapes and brush bristles if possible. If not, you can do a lot with just one brush. For a surface, I have an inexpensive pad of watercolor paper here. It's student grade. I don't normally use this. In fact, I like to use scraps of my good paper. But if I'm just practicing certain strokes, it should be fine. For glazing, however, I'm going to use this piece of professional paper. Better paper makes a huge difference for very wet brushwork. If you're working on student paper for the wet brushwork, just try to use a lighter brush load. That should help. When I'm doing studies or practice with oils, I just use these inexpensive canvas boards. It's not something I plan to frame, so it's fine. Well, let's begin. I'm going to start with 2 strokes that I refer to as invisible strokes. Invisible meaning you can't normally see the brush marks or seams between the strokes. These are glazing and blended brush strokes. Both are extremely useful. And I'm using a 1/2 inch flat mixed fiber brush for watercolor. I'll start by showing you the glaze. So we'll pick up the very diluted paint mix. This is very thin. In oil, you'd have a lot of solvent and a touch of oil. I've loaded my brush and tapped it onto a paper towel just to lighten it a bit. And then I'll paint horizontal strokes, overlapping. In watercolor or thinned acrylic, it's nice to do 2 or 3 strokes in the same spot, and then you move down, overlap a little bit, 2 or 3 strokes, move down, and so on. For oil, you could restroke at will. But again, for the water media paints, you don't want to go back to where you worked unless you really have to. Now let's take a little more paint, touch it off, and here we'll make a shape. Another thing I encourage students to do when they practice is to make different shapes, challenge yourself, and keep working at it until you can get a nice smooth glaze within the shape. We'll load again, and here I'm just going to make just kind of a kooky shape, just have some fun with it. You can be orderly, you can be creative, just enjoy this. It's just the idea of training your hand to get the even spread. And notice you don't see seam lines. If I were going to continue working, I'd continue to load with the thinned paint. But let me show you blended strokes, which is the same idea except you're using a denser paint, less dilution. Look at the difference. It's applied pretty much the same way. 2 or 3 strokes, and then you move down, overlapping. And with oil or heavy body acrylic, you could keep stroking. If you need to with a thin paint, you can tilt your paper to spread the pigment a little bit more. But again, you can see there are no seam lines. It's one body of paint. And it's a lot darker than the glaze. The glaze is very transparent. Blended strokes are more opaque. You can increase opacity by painting the paint on thicker, or you can use a more opaque paint. So let's do the same thing. We'll take the denser paint and we'll create the same shapes. Notice that I cover the shape and then I leave it alone. Reload the brush. Notice that I'm not lightening my load. That's because less diluted paint is denser, a little more viscose, and so it doesn't flow quite as much. Now this was all done with a flat brush, but here we have a round. It's a medium round. The way you stroke the paint on is a little bit different. Instead of horizontal strokes going in the same direction, you load it, lighten it a bit, and then you do a zigzag effect. It's kind of like, I call it swabbing. So we'll load the brush. Actually, yeah, we do need more brush load for this one. It's a smaller brush head. And notice how I'm just swabbing, making sure I get coverage, and continuing down the paper. Not going back unless I really have to. And you do the same thing with the denser paint in order to make a blended stroke. That's it. It's just a different way of applying the paint, but the effect is very similar. Now, when glazing and blending with either oil or heavy body acrylics, you just have to follow the process for thinning those paints. And that would be adding a solvent such as turpentine or mineral spirits, plus a touch of drying oil for oil paints. And you can take it as far as a 1-to-1 ratio, or adding water and/or medium to your thicker acrylics. And then reduce your dilution for the blended strokes. Now with those 2 thicker mediums, you can stroke repeatedly, which is nice, especially with oil paints. Now we'll go on to the 3rd stroke, and this is called a scumble stroke, another very handy brush stroke. I'm using the student grade paper because this is a stroke that can work with the lesser paper. It's not very, very wet. The negative is this paper doesn't have a lot of texture to it, This stroke works especially good when you have textural cold pressed paper, but we can still work it. I'm going to use my round brush, which I find is the best one to use. Load it with moderately diluted paint, lighten my brush load. It was initially a little too heavy, but there we've lightened it. And you just kind of allow your brush on its side to skip and hop along the surface. Remember, you can turn your brush. It's a very spontaneous, sporadic movement. Here's a close-up. And one exercise I like to do is to start with a very loaded brush and then just keep working my way across the surface until the brush load is gone, basically, and you're left with a dry brush. Now you can see how the brush mark gets drier and drier looking as we move, and a little bit lighter too. It's actually a different look as your brush load lightens. Now that paint was moderately diluted. I'm going to take some denser paint, less dilution, and lighten my brush load really good. You can see that you get the drier mark, but it's darker, and that's how you handle that. Now pay attention to how you hold the brush. I don't hold it straight up, that makes it too perfect looking. I don't lay it too flat, although you could. It's a slight angle, and that helps you get the paint on the paper, but it's still a sporadic looking mark. Now I was using a round. You can use a flat brush, as you can see here. It gives a slightly more linear look because of that flat bristle edge. But you can turn it and use the side of the flat brush, or there may be times when you want a more linear looking mark. You can use the denser paint. The idea is to play around, change the direction of your brush, just work with this, experiment, push yourself, and see what you can come up with. Now this has all been wet paint on dry paper. You can also spritz your paper with a little water if you're working with a water media paint, and then scumble over the semi-wet area, allowing the paint to spread at will. It's a different look. The real look, though, of scumbling is more of the wet paint on the dry paper. If you're using oil or heavy body acrylic, you can thin your paint to get the same kind of marks. The brush action is pretty much the same. Or you can use it undiluted for a thick impasto scumble effect. Now the fourth stroke that we'll cover is another one that we call a broken stroke, meaning it's a short mark, and it also allows some of the paper to show through, just like we saw with the scumble stroke. I'm going to begin with a flat brush. You load your brush, lighten the load, and then you push it on the paper. You have a short movement and then lift, creating what we call a dab. So it's down, move, up. Now it's not a long mark like this. This would be a dash or just a direct line. It's a short movement. Down, move, up, down, up. Remember the little movement, and notice they're not overlapping. There's space and they work together as a grouping. But of course you can overlap. Just a little bit. You have to make sure that you still have paper showing, and you can move your brush in different directions. It creates a different look when you do that, doesn't it? The Impressionists liked to use this brush mark. In fact, Monet was the one who really made it famous. You can do it with a round as well, but you want to make sure it's a decent size. This one's even a little small, but let me show you. Load the brush, and you move, same movement, down, move, up, down, move, up, just a little movement. These are even a little bit long. There you go. See, if you just use the tip and move a tiny bit, the larger the brush, the larger the mark. Now you can pre-wet the surface. I'll do that here. Just apply a little water, load the brush, and make the same mark except on a wet surface. And you can see how it makes a blurrier brush mark. And while our brush load is light, here's what that dab would look like. You get the same mark, but it's lighter in value. You can get these little spots of paint where it puddles. To take care of that, you can tilt your surface to help the pigment move throughout the mark. Or you can use a damp brush and just soak it up with your brush. If you want to, you can cover your paper with these marks, or you could make a shape, like maybe an apple. There you go. You could make a form. And remember, the angle of your brush will make a difference. Experiment and see what you like. Turn your brush and try different brushes. If dabbing with a thick medium, such as oil or heavy body acrylic, your variation in dilution levels can provide you with a similar thin look, but with less dilution, you can also achieve a nice impasto dab, thick paint. And finally, the last mark we're going to cover is splattering, which is a lot of fun. It works best with a small round, regardless of medium. So you'll pick up a medium load with your brush, and then you tap your brush over the surface. You can also use a second brush to tap it. You could also fling it with your hand. It's usually best to have a fully loaded brush, and it can work with just about any dilution level as long as it's fluid. However, if you're working with heavy body acrylic or oil, you definitely need to thin your paint well. You can splatter into a wet surface. If I spritz some water droplets on there and then splatter, look at the very cool effect you can get. You can do the same thing into a wet surface where you've wet the entire area. You can use a flat brush, although it is more difficult. I find that you have to turn it on its side like this, but look at the interesting splatter it creates. So experiment. Different brushes will give you different marks, different dilutions will give you different values. And what happens is when you practice, you begin to be able to feel like you have a little more control over where those splatters are going to go. Now you can also use a second color. We haven't talked about that yet, but it's kind of fun to splatter wet paint into wet paint with a second color. You get little areas where they blend, at least in water media. Another thing you can do is do it at an angle, and you can see here you get kind of a mark that has a little more movement. Or you can tilt your paper to get the same effect. It's creating a directional mark, which is kind of cool. Now let's go back to the scumble marks. They've dried a decent amount, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to scumble the yellow over top of the mostly dry paint. So I'll clean my brush well, load up the brush, and scumble on some of the yellow. If we go back to the glazes, I can take a very thin glaze of that yellow and apply it over my pink, and look what we get. You do the same thing you did the first time, but with a different color, and it gives you a very dynamic, complex color. This can be done in any medium. Let me show you a very quick exercise we can do using each one of these strokes we just learned. We're going to create a simple landscape study. To begin our small study, I mix up an initial batch of the colors I think I'll need. I'm using only 3 colors, the rose violet, Winsor blue red shade, and Hansa yellow medium. I'm going to begin by applying a peach colored glaze to the top 2/3 of my paper. Glazes are really nice for initial color tones or to change the tone of another color. Here we're using it as the sky color. Then I'll apply a glaze of the yellow to the bottom third. Where the colors meet, the seam, I'm allowing them to just touch, not overlapping too much, although you could depending on the effect that you want. We'll let that dry a bit as I mix up some additional colors. I'm using all 3 colors to create a muted violet color for some mountains. It should be a slightly less transparent glaze, denser paint, closer to a blended layer. And I'll make an even less diluted version for some distant trees that we'll use a little later. The first layer may not be completely dry, we'll see. I'll use my flat brush to apply a thin blended layer for distant mountains. This may be a little too close to a glaze. Let me pick up a little more paint to increase the amount of pigment. And the edge is softening into the sky in spots, so the first layer wasn't totally dry. That's okay. This is what I consider a color study, so perfection isn't necessary. And now I'll use a small round brush, pick up this muted green that I mixed, and scumble it in the foreground to imply texture, grasses and such. Notice I'm using the movement and angle we learned earlier. I think I'll thicken the mix that I prepared for the distant trees just a little bit more. I want it fairly dark as they're a vertical plane, and lessening the water in the mix will help accomplish that. The trees are small since they're in the distance, so I'll use a smaller round and dab the paint on. In this way, they'll be conveyed in a more impressionistic manner. It's a fun addition. But the value is a little too dark. So while the paint is still wet, I'll gently tap the paint with paper towel. Just one tap, and that will take off enough of the paint to lighten the value. I'll touch up the scumble with a less diluted version now that the paint is dry. This will give it a little more dimension. This is a form of layering. And once everything is dry, I'll add a touch of splatter for visual interest. I'm going to cover the areas where I don't want splatter. Remember, it can get messy. And then I'll mix up a thin yellow peach color. Once the small round is loaded, I'll tap it over the bottom of the study just a few times. It's often best not to overdo this stroke. And you can see it just provides a little bit of color, some visual interest. And that's it. This is a fun exercise and a great way to practice the strokes you just learned. Just remember, it's not supposed to be a masterpiece. It's practice. Be easy on yourself and enjoy the process. I've enjoyed our brief time together, and I wish you all the best in your painting.